The light this way.
Oh,
that's so nice. Isn't that great? And Chavonne, who made this cake?
Albertsons. Fran ordered it and set up the pictures and everything. Microphones as to who's bossiest. I'll win. and I'll win just because Gretchen didn't want to tell her story. She's like most people that says, I do not have a story. And like most people, she really does. But before we start tonight, I affectionately said I could pimp her out, which is probably not the real correct term. But we have the Historical Society posters. And Jeff Strange did the artwork on them, and he has signed them, and Gretchen's willing to autograph the back of any of them for you, and they're $4. And if you have ever looked on eBay and you're looking for Rosamond memorabilia and Rosamond history and things like that, and you go, where is all this stuff? We have it, so please take advantage of it. I also would like to just take a moment. Therese, where are you? We are the Kern, I'm going to have you stand up. We are the Kern Antelope Historical Society, and Therese is with the state of California. And so it is such an honor to have her come here and witness this. And so we appreciate you making the trip, Therese.
Of the California Conference of Historical Societies.
Yes. And as many of you know, what has been central to Rosamond has been schools and those types of things. And Terry Landseidle had asked, did we want to invite dignitaries? And I said, no, you know, if they're not part of the Historical Society, we don't want to just bring them in to show them off for entertainment. But I will show off Barbara Gaines. Barbara, where are you? And she is the new superintendent of Southern Kern Unified School District. And so this is a chance for her to really get an opportunity to learn about Rosamond. So take the time, introduce yourself to her, tell her how you're connected to the town and to the community. And so, with no further ado, we have Gretchen Winfrey, who I think probably the best words that could be said were said by her dear friend Mary Nelson. Mary, where are you? Mary Nelson Green. And Mary said that Gretchen is one of the most thorough, meticulous, generous, thoughtful, relationship-oriented, intrinsically motivated people she knows. And without a doubt, that is 100% true. That was me that turned off. I'm thinking that's not an accident. Okay, all right. So, Gretchen these were her grandparents, and I'm going to let her tell you the story of her grandparents.
My grandparents came to California in the early 1900s. I'm thinking about 1910 or 11. And the story that I was told is my grandmother. Can you turn it up? Is it better now? Okay, I'm supposed to talk right into this. My grandmother had a respiratory infection for months and months and months. I suspect she had what they called consumption at that time. They lived back in Missouri. She was not getting better, and so the whole family moved to the Imperial Valley, where it was a desert, where it was dry. And so they came in I think about 11. My mother was born in 1903, and my mother is the one right behind my grandfather. There were 3 children. My aunt married my mother, and then the youngest one was actually born in California, my Aunt Lou.
There is, whoops, and before we go on there, Gretchen's grandfather died before she was born.
3 months before I was born, actually.
And you talk about the power of a legacy that you will leave. Gretchen's grandfather stated something, and Gretchen, what was that was stated long before you were born and something that would influence your life?
Well, he had 3 daughters, and the rule, which was not to be questioned, was none of his girls got married before they completed college. And he was born in the 1860s, late 1860s. So this is kind of a novel thing for a man of that era to have as his rule. But all of his girls did follow that. My Aunt Lou, the youngest one, maybe stretched it a tiny bit. She got married in the afternoon and graduated from SC in the evening.
Now, Gretchen, I hear that there was a special story about your mother graduating from USC. She wasn't in the Dumb Bunny Club.
That was my Aunt Lou.
That was your Aunt Lou.
Yeah, there's an article in the LA Times, the smartest girl that ever graduated from USC was my Aunt Lou. Back then.
And I think had Gretchen graduated from USC, she probably would have given her a run for her money. And so, whoops, sorry about that. So here is Gretchen.
I'm the little one.
And Gretchen, where were you born?
I was born in Hopeville, down in the Imperial Valley. It's not too far from El Centro. When my grandparents first went to the Imperial Valley, I think they went to a place called Nyland, and then they moved around a little. In fact, I even have a picture when they first went to Imperial Valley. They lived in a tent. It had a wooden floor and wooden sides and canvas top, and everybody did that when they first moved to the area. But this was in Hopeville.
And what was kind of the temperature, the climate, those things?
It's dry. That's why my grandmother did so well. My grandmother lived to be over 100, so the move to California was a good one for her.
And, okay, and there is...
That's my dad. He lived in Hopeville also, but his mother and father had divorced. His father was in Chicago. His mother remarried and moved to Hopeville. And he spent some of his life traveling back and forth between Chicago and Hopeville on the train as a child, by himself, which to me just is amazing. He was also born in 1903, as was my mother. But he was a couple of years behind her in school because of the traveling back and forth between.
Now, Gretchen, here is this handsome young man, and of course your mom was a little bit smitten with him, but your grandma had a different thought. What was her thought?
Well, my grandparents lived right across from the high school. I think this is the story you want me to go up with. Okay. My grandparents lived right across from the high school, and all the high school kids hung out at my grandparents' home. So my mother and father knew each other, of course, through school, even though they weren't in the same grade, but all the high school kids seemed to migrate to my grandparents' home. And my father, when he was in high school, decided he needed money, so he quit high school and went to work on a farm. Because that's what we did in Imperial Valley. It was a farming community. And my grandmother found out that he had quit school. Now my grandmother was little, not very big, but she was something you didn't want to mess with. And so she marched herself out in her dress and her shoes, and she always wore shoes with stacked heels. She marched herself out in the field. This is the story I was told. Marched herself out in the field to where he was on the tractor and said, "You get down off that tractor right now, and you get back to school because that's what you should do." And so that's what he did.
Now, Gretchen, there you are, and you're in Holtzville, and things were kind of interesting during the first 8 years. The wars, right, we're in the beginning of World War II?
Yes, because I was born in '39. My younger sister was born in 1942. So the war is on.
And what is happening in the community at that time?
Well, Patton, General Patton, had a base not too far from Holtville. The ladies in the community got together and they had a canteen that they ran for the servicemen. And my grandmother was very, very, very involved in that. I remembered when I was little, we always had servicemen because they would bring people home from the canteen. We even had a lieutenant colonel living with us. He needed a place to stay, didn't want to, or it wasn't available for him to live out on the base. And so he called my mom and said, "Okay, I'd like to come and look at the house and inspect the room," and he says, "I also want to inspect the kids." He was a bachelor, so he also wanted to check us out. As it turned out, he did rent the room, and he became a lifelong friend.
And what was the rule about fowl during that time?
About which?
Fowl, birds.
Oh, during the war, because we had food ration, and some of your parents may have talked about, some of you may have remembered this. We had coupon books and we had tokens for food. And of course, Imperial Valley was a place where they raised a lot of rice and other agricultural crops. And so you were not allowed, the general public was not allowed to hunt. And the farmers were allowed to shoot the birds that came in after the crops, but they were not allowed to pick up the carcass. And of course you had a lot of wonderful duck that was laying around that supposedly couldn't get picked up. But every morning I remember opening the kitchen door and there'd be a pile of duck on the stoop. Of course we had no idea where they came from. We had so many duck that my mother even gave some of the duck to the general's wife who was leasing a house in the town. And when her husband questioned her about where she got the duck, she said, "I shot him." She never did tell him where she got the duck.
Now, Gretchen's mom was quite a historian, and she kept records of all sorts of things. And Gretchen, tell us about this letter that you received. It didn't come in just in the mail.
No, it came via mail. Our next door neighbor was a man who enlisted in the CBs
And
during
this is
World War II.
1944.
And he had been my absolute best friend. There weren't other kids around. In fact, I had imaginary playmates. In fact, my sister was named for my 2 imaginary playmates. But I was his shadow, and so when he went in the service, he wrote me these email. Of course, I couldn't read them, but he wrote me these email notes.
And what is so precious about these female notes is the trivialness of it. You know, he writes to her and he says, "I received your Valentine." You know, not these deep, thoughtful things, but how are the cats? Glad you're feeding the chickens. and I received your Valentine. And so these special, special memories have been documented. And then I want you to note right here. This is Gretchen, and Gretchen, what are you doing?
Well, I used to spend a lot of time in that tree. I like that tree.
Now you stop and think, during this era, little girls weren't encouraged to climb trees. They weren't encouraged to be bold. And here she is, she's had a grandfather who before she was born has said, I expect my girls to go to college. And here is just kind of this risk taker, this willing to take on the world. And this is Gretchen, so true to her form now.
That's the high school across the street. And in fact, I can tell you, I don't think I told you this story about the tree. I didn't tell you the story about me wandering out in the desert, did I?
No.
I was in this very tree, and a horse-drawn wagon went by, and I've always been crazy about horses. And I remember this. I was just had turned 3 because my sister wasn't born yet, which is how I can date it. I followed the horses and the wagon. I never did that. My mother said, she says, but you never left. And I said, I know, but I just had to go see where the horses were going. I ended up out in the desert. And it was during the war, obviously, and there was a displaced persons encampment. They had, these people that had been driven out of Europe. And my memory, I have some memories of this. My memory of it was like a gypsy encampment out there. And I was out there for some time, and of course my poor mother missed me and was going crazy. And the entire school got involved, and they were out looking for me. And I remember they finally figured out I didn't belong in this encampment with this group of kids with whom I was playing. And so the man who was in charge loaded me in his car. I remember the trip back into Hopeville, and they took me to the city hall, and I had just had my hair cut from when I had been in the city hall with my grandmother the week before, and I kept trying to tell a lady what my name was, but I had my hair cut, and she didn't recognize me. And of course, by then I remember just being terribly in tears. They were leading me down the steps to take me to El Centro when one of the high school kids that had been out looking for me drove by and saw me, and that's how I got reunited with my parents. And believe it or not, I did not get in trouble.
Now, I didn't hear this story before, but I want you to just tune in. She followed a horse into the desert. We'll see if there's a connection here. Looks like Gretchen. And so...
Well, I'm sure a lot of you, there were these people that had ponies that went around and you got your picture taken on the ponies. So this is me with my sister having my picture taken on a pony.
On a pony. Horses again. And then your family moves. Where do they move to?
Well, my father had been working ever since really he left high school. I believe he worked at the Valley Auto Supply in El Centro. And he moved, he eventually ended up as the store manager. And he had gotten to know one of the customers who owned a trucking company in Los Angeles, a Mr. Crow. And Mr. Crow convinced my dad to go into business for himself with Mr. Crow's financial backing. And so my dad did. He went to Ventura and set up a welding supply store and supplied oxygen and acetylene to the welders, and he was a Lindy distributor as well as he sold Lincoln welders. And if any of you have ever worked in that field, you know those are names. But it took us took us a year to find a place to live. So for a year, my mom was still in Imperial Valley, and my dad was in Ventura.
And I don't know how many of you happen to have in your family history your very own stock certificates. And once again, just the preciousness of keeping history. Gretchen's mother was a phenomenal documenter of the family history. And Gretchen, who are these players over here?
Well, it's my dad, my mom, myself, and my younger sister, Roberta. And this is in the house in Ventura.
Now, how did that house get to be in Ventura?
Well, it was built in Ventura, but it was built not where it is currently located. It was built with a few other houses that needed to be moved to make room for the parking lot that the Sears and Roebuck store needed to have in Ventura. And so this and other houses were sold. My dad bought one, which is the way we finally got a house. He bought the house and it was moved in. I just saw the picture of the street where we lived on Tuesday when I was over in Ventura before the house was moved in. And so I'm going to get that picture from the people who now live in the house that was moved in.
And there is Gretchen, and Gretchen starts high school over in Ventura. And tell us about that.
That school, I mean, that high school is no longer standing. It had to be demolished. But that is the way the Ventura Senior High School looked when I went to Ventura Senior High School. And it was just grades 10, 11, 12, because we had a 3-year junior high. So that's my high school graduation senior picture.
Now, Gretchen, in high school, they didn't have Xbox, they didn't have Facebook, so kids had to do other things to be involved. What sorts of things were you involved in?
Well, you know, most high schools, I think, back then anyway, had organizations. And I was in the Science Club, and I was in the Ushers Club, and the Ushers Club was, we were the ones who got to usher at community events, because Ventura had a gorgeous big auditorium. They still do, Ventura High School. And so there would be weekend community events, and we would usher those. Also, at assemblies, the kids would all go into the assembly, and you had to turn in a task to your next period teacher, and we were responsible for handing out passes and not giving passes to people who didn't show up at the assembly.
And you also were involved in a musical group over there?
Well, it was one of the classes I took. I was in choir.
And then in the science club, there was something that happened with the chemistry teacher that got your attention.
Well, you know, it was really something that my dad did. When I was taking chemistry, my dad was in the welding supply business, and he had put in a tank to store liquid oxygen. And so he would he brought to my chemistry class, and I think he did it for a few years afterwards, he brought a container of liquid oxygen. Of course, none of us had ever seen liquid oxygen. And we would freeze strawberries and shatter them, and freeze corks and shatter them. And it was, a very motivating thing for the chemistry class.
Well, and apparently it was a little bit more than motivating, because Gretchen got the top science student, and it says Gretchen Estelle Garrett, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wilbur Garrett, and it gives the address, is winner of the 1957 Bosch and Loam Science Medal at Ventura High School. She is thought to be the only girl to have won the annual award at the local school. As a winner of the award, she is eligible to compete for a scholarship at the University of Rochester. She is pictured with a classmate in her physiology class.
Now, this was really the first time I'd ever really gotten an award. I was a little overwhelmed.
And you, once again, you just sure see where the power of the family came in that one. And so, Gretchen has this unique ability to maintain relationships. And as a matter of fact, her son, or her nephew, Todd, said, she is the most stable and solid thing in his life, and she has a talent for building connection through story. And here she is with her high school classmates. And Gretchen, where were you last weekend?
Well, I think I told some of you, the class of 1957 got together Tuesday, and we all celebrated jointly our 80th birthdays. And there were 75 of us there, although not all of them were classmates. Some of them were spouses.
That power of connection. Now, Gretchen, you go up to San Jose State, and what do you do up there?
Well, I started out as a nursing major because one of the clubs I had belonged to in high school was the nursing club. And I really thought I wanted to be a nurse until I went through one semester of nursing classes and decided that was not what I wanted to be. So I changed my major and became a chemistry major. And I majored in chemistry until I was going into my junior year, and I happened to take a class called physical chemistry, and I decided I didn't want to be a chemist either. Partly because I'm really not that, I don't think mathematically. And I was told by one of my lab instructors, who was a female, she said, if you go into this field as a female, you're going to have to go ahead and become a doctor because you're not going anywhere as a female except to be a lab tech. And I thought, well, this isn't really what I want to do. And at the same time, I had a roommate who was really active in the Girl Scouts. She had been an assistant camp counselor and was actually had actually gotten to the point where she was assistant to the whole, or to the camp director. And so she said, why don't you come and be a Girl Scout counselor? So I did. I went, and for a whole summer I lived outside, up between Pollock Pines and Lake Tahoe, and I was a counselor. Well, I started out as an assistant and ended up being in charge of the 10-year-olds before the summer was over, and just loved working with kids. And I have to say, as an aside, when we went to Ventura and my dad was first starting business, my mother went back to work as a teacher. And I had said, after seeing all the work she did, I will never be a teacher. It's too much work. But then I just so loved working with those kids that summer. So I changed my major from chemistry to education. So I ended up majoring in physical science, minoring in life science, with the education as my goal. So I had to go an extra year.
And you graduate from college, and you think you have a job in the bag. And what happens?
Well, I had applied after, towards the spring of my 5th year. I'd applied and really wanted to stay in the Bay Area. I loved the Bay Area. I had applied to LA, and I'd gotten jobs offers down there, and I'd applied to areas around Santa Maria, and I'd gotten job offers there, but I had a good job offer, I thought, up in the Bay Area. There had been like 40 applicants, and they were down to 2 of us, and I knew the other guy had a master's degree, and I thought, nah, they're not going to hire him. He's going to cost them too much. So I thought, they're going to hire me. Well, they hired him. The problem was, I was going to travel with 3 sorority sisters
And
around
she
the
had a
United
very
States.
lengthy itinerary planned.
I'm going to take these glasses off. I had to keep them on because I just had cataract surgery. But now that the sun is down, I can take them off. Yeah, we had planned this trip around the United States for months. We knew we were going to camp some, and since some of us had never camped before, we got the tents and we went out and we practiced camping, and we practiced cooking on a propane stove. And I mean, we tried to be organized. We had our itinerary. We knew where we were going to be. We gave our parents all these lists. If you know, on this date, you can mail us a letter here. We had it organized, we thought. And so I was leaving within a few weeks of school being out, and I had no job. So I got on the phone from my house in Ventura. I called every county office within 100 miles, talked to Bakersfield. They said, yeah, we have this job out in this little town out in the desert. I said, okay. My sister and I drove out here, and I interviewed with Mr. Lawson, Judd Lawson, and Matt Purcell, who some of you may know from a long time ago. And they offered me a job, and I took it.
And she took it. And so, however though, she comes to Rosamond, and she finds out how many other single teachers are in town.
Where did you get this picture? That's not one from me.
No, it's not.
School all over again. Re-enrolled all the kids. It was like the beginning. Some of you who have worked in the schools know what a hassle that must have been. But for me it was easier because I no longer had 7 academic credits. I was teaching science for about 4 periods, and then for the other 3 I had typing and choir and drafting. Now that last one was interesting because I didn't know anything about drafting. But my mother happened to know the gal that was head of the drafting department in Ventura at Shell Chemical. So I went to Ventura and got a weekend crash course in drafting. And I think I did a fairly good job of teaching drafting.
Well, you know, if you're having the Shell engineers helping you out, you're probably in good shape.
I don't think anybody here was one of my students, were they?
Now, during this time, Mary, can I have you stand up? Whoops, Mary, I'm going to have you sit down. Sorry. Sorry, I got my slides out of order, so we'll go with the slides. Now, Mr. Lawson.
That's Mr. Lawson in the cowboy hat.
Yeah. Now, he had a little bit of a theory about this poor, lonely girl coming from Ventura.
Read music and play the treble clef because I had played both the violin and the clarinet when I was littler. I never did learn the bass clef, but I could pick out a melody with my right hand.
Okay, looks like I apparently put that in there twice. Now, you heard the story. Gretchen has gone off into the desert chasing a pony. At the age of 11, she is drawing a horse. She comes to the desert, and as luck would have it, her superintendent tells her she needs to go buy a horse.
And so I did.
And tell us about this horse.
Well, this is Alan's go-boy, and he is a Tennessee walker. Mr. Lawson's son, Ken, trained show horses, and this was the show horses, you know, on the big show circuit, Del Mar, Santa Barbara, Indio. I think this is Indio. But I showed horses, and I said to Mr. Lawson, but I can't take off school to go to these horse shows because they were like in February. And, he says, yes, you can. So they hired me a sub and did not dock my pay. And I showed horses. Don't tell anybody.
And I'm thinking Mr. Lawson was sure a smart man.
I was never good because I'm not very competitive in these shows. But it was fun. It was a new thing for me.
Now, this is not Gretchen. This is her friend Stormy Williams, because apparently when you're riding the trails out in the desert, you don't take a lot of pictures of yourself. It was before the selfie stick had been invented. And so, Gretchen, during this horse time, you're riding horses and you're no longer showing.
Well, I did show, but I showed a lot of Mr. Lawson's horses. Mr. Lawson's daughter-in-law, Mickey, and I got to be super good friends. And I would go out 2 times a week after school, and Mickey and I would ride the desert, and I would ride with, Mr. Lawson's horses. And then during the summer, Mickey and I would haul the horses to the little local horse shows. And sometimes we'd show Western in the morning and then pull off the Western stuff and put on the English stuff and show English in the afternoon. Same horse, but...
Now, you had a special horse by the name of Buck.
Well, that was one of Mr. Lawson's horses. He was a jewel. He was a buckskin horse, and he was an interesting horse. He's what people call a coal-backed horse. Some of you who are around horses know. You put the saddle on him, and you let it sit for a while, and you talk to him, and you pet him, and you go off and do something, and then you'd cinch the saddle up a little bit, then you'd let it sit for a while, and you'd go off and you'd talk, and you'd pet him, and you just gentled him into the fact that he was going to put the saddle on his back. And he did, and he was absolutely no trouble. I rode that horse up in the Tehachapi's when I just had foot surgery, and I probably couldn't have walked 10 feet by myself. I had the whole tennis shoe, and I was in tennis shoes, which you should never do when you're riding anyway. But I had the whole tennis shoe cut up so my foot wasn't bound, and I rode that horse up in the Tehachapi's. Mickey rode that horse when she was 8 months pregnant. She showed the horse when she was 8 months pregnant. But I have seen that horse buck like you would not believe. A man comes in, throws the saddle on, cinched him up, climbed in the saddle, and that horse unloaded the man. He needed a lady's touch. Oh, there's Buck. I'm carrying the American flag. That is Janet's sister Judy on patches, and that's Jerry Williams on his horse. And we were, I think, meeting one of the ETI rides that had come in.
And ETI stands for what?
Equestrian Trails Incorporated. ETI is still around, but the group that was here has been disbanded. A lot of people here were in ETI that are here, sitting right here.
Very much a part of the community. And not only did you have ETI, you didn't run down to Walmart and get your chaps. So where'd they come from?
Oh, well, I ended up, actually, to go back a little, when I first bought the Tennessee Walker, I got a call from Gladys Adams, who some of you may remember. She was in the post office here for years. And she said, I hear you bought a horse, why don't you join ETI? And again, like when Mr. Lawson wandered in and said, go buy a horse, I said, oh, okay. So I said to her, okay. And so I did. I joined ETI, even though the only horse I had was one that really wasn't something you wanted to ride out in the desert. And I participated. I was parade chairman for ETI for some years. And we decided on the chaps, only we bought vinyl material and we made them on my sewing machine, and Leona Fitz brought a sewing machine, and we worked in my apartment and we made these chaps, and we bought the white halters and reins, and we all bought red shirts, and we did our outfitting.
Quite stylish.
It's too bad this picture's so faded, because those shirts were bright, bright, bright red. It was really stunning, especially since our school colors in Rosamond are red, white, and black.
a little bit of a better picture of them. As better as you can get with old pictures. And then, Mary, if I could have you stand up now, sorry. And I'm going to have you come up to the front. Now, this is the original Mary Nelson. And
I called her Mother Mary.
And this was from the yearbook, and it says, "A beautiful and complete Rosamond High School will soon become a reality." The story of how this became possible began with the first formal efforts initiated in 1960. The district could not have a high school until it was unified, which required not only the approval of the Kern County District Reorganization Committee, but also the approval of the California State Board of Education, which was on record as being opposed to unification that would result in small high schools. The complex uphill struggle engaged in by this district depended for success on the dedicated efforts of the District Unification Committee, made up of persevering members who spent many hours each week over a period of years to study the many problems involved and to persuade the proper authorities that unification was necessary for the youth of Rosamond to gain the greatest benefit from the educational program. The presentations of this committee, as led by Mrs. Mary Nelson, chairman, and ably advised by Mr. Bob Nelson, on behalf of the educational future of this community, were the subject of many compliments for their thoroughness, sincerity, and effectiveness of communication. Mr. Al Ridley headed the committee in its initial stages of exploration into the advantages and disadvantages of unification. The efforts of this committee should serve to inspire future efforts to maintain the quality of education for the Southern Kern Unified School District that was envisioned by the stalwart group. The 1965 SAGE is respectfully dedicated to the members of this District Unification Committee. This was Mary's mother. Gretchen and Mary taught together in their younger years. And so, Mary, on behalf of your mother, we would like to applaud. And so, thank you so much for coming from good stock. And right here, this is Mary.
You want the mic, Mary?
And, you know, we think nowadays of people graduating from college at 21, 22. Some are like on the 29-year plan, you know, they're not doing it too fast. Mary, how old were you?
19.
19. When you graduated from
Stanford.
Stanford College?
Yeah.
Oh, at 19. Oh, okay, so this is doable. All right. And she came back to teach mathematics. And
Mary has been a big part of my life because we got to be super good friends.
yes.
Still are.
And you will see this interweaving. Dolores, stand up. And I just want you to take a look at these three hot babes. How about if you three stand side by side, John, so you can get a suitable picture. And Fran, we'll let you do the paparazzi moment here. And as this goes, you will see how this story continues to unfold. So I will have you ladies have a seat. Well, you can sit back there, that's fine. Mary shared with me, now mind you, you've got Gretchen climbing trees, graduating with science honors, and all of these other things. She and Mary were known for being out in the desert riding motorcycles.
Only once. For me. Mary was more.
Now, Gretchen was here at the time of the dedication of Rosamond High School. Gretchen, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, not really. Are you going to talk about the fact that it wasn't ready when it was supposed to be?
Well, yeah, we'll add on that one. Just real quick here, this is Mrs. Graves.
That's, yeah, the Graves.
And so, when you're looking at Charles Graves and the family history, this is his wife. This is J.A. Lawson, right?
Right, yeah, that's Judd Lawson.
Okay. And, you know, the ground broke in 1964. The goal was to start it in 1966, right?
In September.
In September. And Gretchen, now of course, now you'd have to, one, know how thorough Gretchen is. So you've seen her plans for summer vacation. So Gretchen, how long was your order to set up a science class?
Well, I didn't know that until you showed me the piece of paper. You know, we had taught junior high, and now suddenly we're going to become a high school. And we're going to be teaching chemistry, and we're going to be teaching biology, and you take materials. Now, you must have gotten this from maybe Miss Ann over there. Anyway, according to what's on my paper, she said my initial order was 160 pages. But the thing that I need to tell you about that is the order came in at the beginning of the 1966 school year, and the high school was not ready to be occupied. So there were boxes in my science classroom, because we taught biology, and we taught chemistry, and we taught all of the upper classes. I was teaching still in the same junior high classroom with boxes stacked floor to ceiling on each side of the room. I'm sure the fire department would have had a fit. And the kindergarten tables were my lab tables, because that's the only tables we had at the moment. So I taught chemistry for several months on kindergarten lab tables.
Now, when you look at the community and you look at what people did, parents were involved. They were eyeball deep in the school system. They were eyeball deep in what was going on. Things were not happening unless parents were involved. It was an open door. You had the Catalina committee for...
Well, that's, before we had a high school, of course, the 8th grade was the highest you could go to school in Rosamond, and so there was a major event happening when the 8th graders graduated, or towards the end of their year, and they took the whole class to Catalina, all the 8th graders. I only went on one of those trips. It was pretty amazing, and it was the parents who put it together. They organized it, they raised the money. Every 8th grade student went to Catalina. It was the first time some of these kids had been out of the valley, and it was just amazing. I remember sitting with some of the boys when we stopped at Knott's Berry Farm to have lunch, and I don't think they'd ever seen a table set with a couple of forks, you know, the salad fork, the regular fork, the knife, and it was like they were just, what's this? It was really funny, but it was a great experience for them.
You had the PTA executive board. You had the high school study group. Once again, all being run by parents. You had room mothers, the executive board of band parents clubs, PTA chairman. The community was alive and involved in the schools.
Very, very much so.
And the social aspect of it went through there.
This was an article that was written after the high school was open and operating. And when the high school opened, I remember Matt Purcell, who was the first principal, came to me and said, I want you to go start a science club. Sort of like when Mr. Lawson said, I want you to go buy a horse. I said, okay. So I said, okay. And so I did. And the science club, we went a lot of places. I don't know if any of you went on the science club trips with us. Some of you did. Yeah, some of you did. We went to a lot of places. This was written after one of our trips.
And once again, just this intimate connection. And if you know Gretchen, you are involved in her life, in her heart. She does not hold things back. And it says the first stop was Ventura to pick up firewood at Miss Garrick's parents' home. Of course, that's where you would stop to get firewood.
A lot of people did know my parents because on the trips we took in that direction, my parents were involved.
And, you know, they just go on and on about what a wonderful time they had. We spent an hour and a half romping joyfully through the magnificent forest.
I think we went to the Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens, didn't we that time? Okay.
Yes. And then came the food, our wiener roast on the beach. The weather was chilly, but some of us went wading despite the weather. Around that night, 21 tired and happy teenagers pulled into the gates of RHS. Thank you, Miss Garrick, Miss Newman, Mrs. Castle, and Mrs. Turner.
So those were the drivers on the people that drove the cars that took the kids.
And, you know, once again, Gretchen's ability to bring people in. I will just share a quick side note with you.
Surfing, and she had her computer up there, and she was working on a PowerPoint. And I said, oh, I really need to learn how to do PowerPoint. Margaret knows how. I didn't know how. And so I had a on the airplane lesson in how to do PowerPoint. So I came home and then I put the PowerPoint thing together that we originally used on those display boards before we paid to have them done professionally.
And within Gretchen's relationships with the Wildflower Reserve, she also was friends with
Milt Stark, who was just an awesome person. And this is at one of our Poppy Reserve Mojave Desert Interpretive Association annual meetings. And this is Milt Stark, the gal that is receiving the Jane Pinero Award that year. Dorothy Bolt, who at this point was in her 90s, late 90s, and myself, and Margaret over there also has received this Jane Pinero Award.
And as I said, pay attention to the beginning. Here is Gretchen, here is Dolores, and there is Mary, and their haughty days here. And you girls didn't go and spend $200 a day to go to Disneyland. What did you do for fun?
Well, during the summers, we always created things. We would sometimes have pool parties, and it really didn't matter whether you had a pool or not, we'd have a party. We also would play golf, which was a very interesting thing to do because it's really more like
Croquet, I believe is what
more
Mary
like
said.
croquet than playing golf. And then we would also take the boats up to the San Joaquin Delta.
And so there they are taking the boats. Now, in true Gretchen's form, she didn't know how to drive a boat. So what did you do?
Well, you know, ladies didn't drive boats. Your husband drove the boat, you just got to sit. So when we were taking the boats, and this was Jerry's boat, Mary already had a boat up there, but we trailered Jerry's boat up there. And I went to the library. We didn't have YouTube and stuff like that at then. I went to the library and I bought a book about how to drive a boat. And so I would lay in bed at night and I would drive the boat and read the book. And actually it worked. The first time I had to dock the boat, Mary went in first and they all lined up along the dock in case they needed to fend me off. But I managed.
And then for, what are we at, 60 years?
Long
just about?
time, long time. Mary finally bought a big boat. Mary and her husband bought a big boat so that I didn't have to trade her one up. So this was all of us on the big boat.
And these women have been everywhere and done everything. How many road scholars and elder hostels have you been to, roughly?
I've been to over 25.
And how many times have you been to Europe?
I went to Europe in '64 before I was traveling with the gals. And then we've been to Europe. Dolores, help me out.
More times than you can count.
Couple more times anyway, yeah.
Yes, they have cruised the Mediterranean. They have been Vienna to Amsterdam, South America, the Panama Canal, and this summer they are doing the National Parks Tour, doing Zion, the North Rim of Grand Canyon, Bryce, Arch, and Canyonlands.
We're leaving next week to do that.
And, well, you just see if you can pay attention here, Gretchen. Now she's going to really feel like a fool here.
I am. Oh, that's Todd. When he moved, I could see it. That's my nephew, Todd. Oh, thank you, Chavonne. Chavonne's been tapping all my family resources.
And then Todd said something that was just so special. He said, Gretchen taught me that looking at the stars opened up the world to him. And I just thought that is so appropriate of Gretchen. And September 6th was her special day. And anybody that can carry a tune better than me, I will have you join in this. And
Oh, those are my other nieces and their kids, my sister's kids.
happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, dear Gretchen. Happy birthday to you.
And so,
That's neat.
with no further ado, thank you, Gretchen, so much.
Oh, thank you all. This is just really amazing. Thank you.
And we have birthday cake that the birthday cake fairies are bringing out. And Fran has something special to present to you.
Before, I don't want to forget this. Well, shall I do your thing that you gave me after you do this?
It's up to you. It's your birthday.
Yeah, Fran gave me something that this is historical.
If I did.
Down here and get it. Someone found this at a yard sale, and it's been given to the Historical Society, and it says, "Spring in the Antelope Valley, the desert where that is close to the sky." And it's a poem, and it's written by someone named Charles Racine. Does anyone know that name? It's beautiful. Anyway, we now have it as Historical Society, and I want to let you guys, my hand is cramping from holding the microphone. If anybody wants to come look at it, I'll leave it out here. And I want to, before we continue, I want to remind all of you that we do have another meeting in a month. It'll be at the library. And Chavonne has, I think, a wonderful program lined up. It's about Rosamond schools, correct?
The history of
History
Rosamond
of Rosamond.
Elementary School, and Ann Yost is going to be doing that. Bless her heart, not Ann's, that's totally irrelevant, but bless Rosamond Elementary School's heart, she turned 90 and nobody noticed.
Rosamond Elementary School.
Rosamond Elementary did. And yeah, not Ann, because boy, now I'd really be in trouble. And so, Fran, is it okay if I tear this a little bit to help Gretchen?
Oh, sure.
Okay, alrighty.
Okay, I'm going to turn, or shall I leave this on or turn it off?
It's up to you, my dear. But I'm going to help you open this a little bit because I know I've had you standing and in the sun and in the and holding the microphone.
Need a stand for it.
So,
And some lights. I need some lights so we can see what it is.
and Fran has a love of tape. There we go.
Oh my word! Look at that!
And so you have a caricature of Gretchen, and this card says all the things she is involved in: Rosamond Hills, family, Saddleback Buttes, Gamma Kappa Delta, California Conference of Historical Societies, Southern Kern Unified School District, Mitchell Caverns, Community, Kern Antelope Historical Society, California Poppy Reserve, and friends.
Oh,
So-
thank you all. Thank you.